They branded her a thief, but a cowboy believed her innocence and became her only family. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows over the small town of Clearwater. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where faces were as familiar as the creaking of old wooden floorboards, and secrets had a way of finding their way into the open. For Emma, it was a place she thought she could escape to, a place where she could rebuild her life after everything had fallen apart. Her father had passed away a year ago, and her mother had never been in the picture. She had always done her best to keep her head down and work hard, taking on whatever job she could find. Whether it was cleaning houses, working in the local diner, or helping out on the farms, Emma did it all. She was the kind of person who believed that hard work and kindness were all anyone ever really needed. But on that particular day, everything changed. It was a Thursday, and Emma had just finished her shift at the small general store on the corner of Maple and Oak. The store wasn't much: dusty shelves lined with canned goods, a counter with the cash register that had seen better days, and the faint smell of fresh bread wafting through the air from the bakery next door. Emma liked working there. Mrs. Turner, the owner, was a kind woman, older than most people in town but full of warmth and laughter. She always made sure Emma had a hot cup of coffee and a sandwich during lunch. But when Emma walked into work that morning, something felt off. The air seemed heavier than usual, and the older man who always came in for his morning paper gave her a strange look. At first, she brushed it off. People were just having bad days. But by the time Mrs. Turner arrived, Emma could see it in the older woman's eyes. Something wasn't right. "Emma," Mrs. Turner said quietly, her voice trembling just enough to make Emma feel uneasy, "can you step into the back for a minute?" Turner closed the door gently behind them, her wrinkled hands fidgeting with a pile of receipts. "What's going on, Mrs. Turner?" Emma asked, her stomach starting to churn. Mrs. Turner hesitated. "Emma, there's been a mistake. The store's been short on money. A few $100s. The police came in this morning and they're looking for whoever did it." She blinked, her mind racing. A few $100s. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had never touched any of the store's money. She had been careful with her work, always counting every penny when she handled the register, always keeping things in order. But it wasn't just the missing money that had Emma's chest tightening. It was the look in Mrs. Turner's eyes, the way she was avoiding her gaze. "Are you saying you think I took it?" Emma's voice cracked as she spoke. Mrs. Turner bit her lip, her eyes filled with a sadness Emma had never seen before. "I don't know what to think, Emma, but the police, well, they said you're the last person who was at the register before it went missing. The only one with access. And I can see the way people are starting to talk." One was tall and broad-shouldered with a stern look on his face. The other was a younger man, his face set in a hard, unfeeling expression. Emma's pulse quickened. "Miss Walker," the tall officer said, his voice cold, "we need to ask you a few questions." The officers searched the back office, checked the store's security footage, though it only showed Emma working behind the counter, and went over every detail of the day. She tried to explain, tried to tell them that she hadn't taken the money, that she'd never stolen anything in her life. But the more she protested, the more they looked at her with suspicion. By the time the questioning ended, the damage was already done. Word had spread fast through the town, as it always did. By the time Emma left the store, heads turned as she walked down the street. Her name was on everyone's lips, and it was no longer tied to the hardworking young woman they had known, but to the one who was now labeled a thief. The whispers followed her everywhere. In the diner, when she tried to buy a cup of coffee, the waitress barely looked at her. In the grocery store, the cashier eyed her with caution, as though Emma might steal something the moment her back was turned. Even the children in the town, who had once waved at her with innocent smiles, now looked away as if she carried a shameful secret. It wasn't just the money that had been stolen, it was her dignity. Emma had never imagined a life where she would be treated like this, where people would turn their backs on her without a second thought. She had tried to be kind, to live honestly. But in Clearwater, kindness was no shield against the force of public opinion. That night, Emma sat alone in the small room she rented above a neighbor's house, her hands trembling as she stared at the ceiling. Her mind raced. What had gone wrong? She thought about Mrs. Turner, who had looked at her with pity, then suspicion. She thought about the police, who had asked the same questions over and over as if they wanted her to crack. Could they really believe she had taken that money? She didn't know who she could trust anymore. The town, once a place of safety, had become a place of judgment. Her reputation had been tainted in a way that seemed impossible to fix. But one thing Emma knew for sure: she couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't live in a town where the truth didn't matter, where a mistake, no matter how small, could cost her everything. As Emma packed her things into an old suitcase, the weight of the situation settled over her like a dark cloud. The town had branded her, and there was no way to unwrite the story they had created. But the next morning, with her suitcase in hand and her heart heavy, she left Clearwater behind. With nowhere else to go, she walked down the dusty road, the morning sun rising behind her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: the road ahead was going to be a lot longer than she had ever imagined. Emma's footsteps echoed as she walked away from Clearwater. With every step, the town seemed to fade behind her, but the weight of what had happened stayed with her like a shadow that would never leave. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay in a place where the people who had once smiled at her now looked at her like she was a stranger, or worse, a criminal. The town she had called home for over a year had turned its back on her in a matter of hours. No one believed she was innocent. No one wanted to believe her. It was easier to accept the story that she had stolen the money, easier to point the finger at the young woman who had never quite fit in than to question the truth. Even Mrs. Turner, the woman who had given Emma her first chance in Clearwater, had begun to doubt her. Emma kept walking, feeling the dirt beneath her shoes and the heavy silence that surrounded her. She didn't know where she would end up, but she couldn't turn back. There's nothing for me there anymore, she thought, her mind clouded with a mixture of anger and hurt. The road stretched ahead of her like an endless ribbon, and she had no destination, no plan. She had no family. Her father had passed away the year before, and her mother, who had never really been a part of her life, was nowhere to be found. Emma was alone in the world, and the loneliness felt colder than the breeze that now brushed through her hair. The first few days after she left Clearwater were the hardest. Emma walked for miles, camping by the side of the road when the sun went down, eating what little food she had left in her bag. There were times when she wondered if anyone would even notice she was gone, if anyone would care. But deep down, she knew the truth. No one in Clearwater cared anymore. The nights were the hardest. In the quiet, when the stars above were her only company, Emma would curl up with her coat wrapped tightly around her and try to sleep. But the cold didn't just come from the air. It came from the emptiness inside her, the hollow feeling of being abandoned, of being branded a thief. She could have gone back to the town. She could have fought to clear her name, but she knew that the longer she stayed, the more impossible it would be to ever be accepted again. The people of Clearwater had made their decision. They had already decided who she was, and once a town turned its back on you, there was no going back. By the end of the week, Emma found herself in a new town. It was a small place, much like Clearwater, but it didn't have the same weight hanging over her. She had heard rumors of work on a ranch just outside of town and decided to take a chance. She didn't have much money left, but she knew she had to find something to keep going. She was tired of the road, tired of being alone, tired of living in fear of being caught by the police for something she hadn't done. The ranch was nothing like the bustling streets of Clearwater. It was quiet, with wide open spaces and a sky so big it seemed to swallow you whole. The owner, an older man with a deep tan and hands calloused from years of hard work, listened to Emma's story without judgment. He didn't ask her questions about where she was from or what had happened. He just nodded and handed her a shovel. "Work's hard," he said, "but it'll keep you busy. And if you're honest with me, we'll get along just fine." She was grateful for the work, even if it was grueling. The ranch was a place where people didn't ask about your past. They didn't want to know who you were or where you had come from. They just wanted you to pull your weight, and that was something Emma could do. For the first few weeks, Emma worked silently, keeping her head down. She cleaned stalls, fed the animals, and mended fences. There was something peaceful about the routine. The work was hard, but it kept her mind busy. And the solitude, while still lonely, was different now. It wasn't the crushing loneliness of being cast out by the people she had known, but the kind of solitude that comes with nature, where the only sounds are the wind in the trees and the occasional neigh of a horse. But the hardest part wasn't the physical labor. It was the quiet moments when she found herself alone in the small cabin she had been given to stay in. In those moments, the memories of Clearwater came rushing back. The accusations, the looks, the way her life had been torn apart by something she didn't even do. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her heart aching with frustration. Why hadn't anyone believed her? Why had they branded her a thief when all she had ever done was try to survive? One evening, after a long day of work, Emma sat on the porch of the cabin, staring at the vast, open sky above her. The air was cool, and the scent of pine trees filled the evening breeze. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on her knees as she thought about everything she had lost. "Hey, you all right?" Jack was a man of few words, preferring to work in silence just like Emma, but there was a kindness in his eyes that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, that someone might understand. "I'm fine," Emma said quickly, forcing a smile, but Jack could see the weariness in her eyes. He didn't push her, though. He sat down beside her, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared out into the distance. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the soft rustling of the trees. "You know," Jack said after a while, his voice soft but steady, "sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you. But you don't have to let it dictate who you are now. Now I'm just trying to survive." She didn't have all the answers, but there was something about Jack's words that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in the world. Maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life piece by piece. As the days passed, Emma found herself settling into the routine at the ranch. She worked harder, learned more, and slowly began to trust the people around her, though she kept her past hidden. The guilt of leaving Clearwater behind, of running away from the accusation, still gnawed at her, but she knew there was no going back. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. The nights grew colder and the stars above shone brighter, but Emma no longer felt the same crushing loneliness she had before. It wasn't that her heart had healed, it hadn't. But at least now she had a purpose. She had work to do, and for the first time in a long while that felt like enough. The ranch was quieter now, the air crisp with the approach of winter. Emma had settled into her routine, the days blending together in a familiar rhythm of work and silence. But even in the stillness, something had begun to shift. She had grown used to the land, to the sound of hooves against dirt, the way the horses seemed to understand her without words, and the feeling of purpose she found in the daily tasks. But there was also something else, a subtle change, like a door that had cracked open just enough to let a sliver of light in. It was the presence of someone who had been watching her more closely than she had realized. Jack, the ranch owner's son, was always nearby. He wasn't the type to demand attention, never loud or boastful, but his quiet strength was undeniable. Over the past few weeks, Emma had noticed the way he moved around the ranch, steadfast and steady, never rushing but always sure. He wasn't like the other men who worked there, the ones who would joke and talk while they worked. Jack kept to himself, working hard but never forcing conversation. He was a man of few words, but his presence was constant, like a silent promise that, no matter what, he would be there when needed. At first, Emma had kept her distance, focusing only on her tasks, trying to blend in as much as possible. She wasn't sure if she wanted to be noticed or if she even deserved to be. Her past still haunted her like a shadow she couldn't escape. The guilt, the shame of being accused of something she hadn't done, still weighed heavily on her heart. It wasn't something she could forget, even if she tried to bury it under layers of work. But Jack had a way of seeing through things. He saw past her quiet exterior and noticed the small details. The way she flinched when someone spoke too loudly. The way she hesitated before accepting a task, as though she expected someone to criticize her at any moment. It wasn't obvious, but Jack had been around long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the golden light stretched across the land, Emma was mucking out the horse stalls when Jack walked over. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the post and watched her work. It was a comfortable silence, not awkward like most silences tended to be. She glanced up, wiping the sweat from her brow, but quickly returned to her task, keeping her head down. Jack spoke first, his voice calm and steady. "You're good at this." She wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not after what had happened in Clearwater. People didn't often say things like that to her anymore. Jack nodded, pushing himself off the post. "You're working hard. Not everyone can keep up with the ranch. It takes more than just muscle, it takes heart. You've got both." She wasn't sure if she had any left to give, but Jack's words lingered in her mind long after he left. He didn't look at her like she was someone with a past that needed to be erased. He didn't look at her like the people in Clearwater had. He just saw her for who she was in that moment, the woman working hard, keeping her head down, and doing the best she could. Days passed, and Jack continued to watch from a distance. Emma didn't know what he was thinking, but she noticed he never asked her anything personal. He never probed into her life or asked why she had come to the ranch. In fact, he barely spoke to her unless it was about the work at hand. But there was something different about the way he did it, like he wasn't just trying to make small talk, but genuinely cared about how she was doing. One evening, after a long day of tending to the horses, Emma sat on the porch of her cabin, staring out at the wide, empty horizon. The sun had already set, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple with specks of stars scattered across it. She had become used to these moments of solitude, but tonight, something about the quiet felt heavier. She didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the fact that winter was coming, and she was about to spend her first real winter on the ranch alone. Or maybe it was the sense that she was still running from something, even though she didn't know where to go anymore. Jack appeared as if from nowhere, stepping out from the shadows. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, and without a word he sat down beside her. She looked at him but didn't say anything. She wasn't sure if she should thank him for the company or just stay silent. But Jack wasn't one for unnecessary words, and neither was she. They sat there in the cold, the silence between them not uncomfortable but filled with understanding. Finally, Jack spoke. "Sometimes," he began, his voice low, "the things we're running from, they catch up with us. They're not always as far behind as we think." She had been running for so long, trying to outrun the accusations, the whispers, the looks of suspicion. But no matter where she went, no matter how many miles she put between herself and Clearwater, the feeling of being unwanted followed her like an echo. "I didn't ask you about your past," Jack continued, his voice steady. "And I'm not going to. You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. But I just want you to know, you don't have to keep running. You don't have to do this alone." Instead, she nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I know," she whispered. "I just don't know how to stop. I'm not going anywhere." He was something else too, a reminder that sometimes, when you least expect it, someone can come into your life and remind you that you're not defined by your past, that you don't have to carry it with you forever. As the night deepened and the stars twinkled above them, Emma felt a flicker of something that had been buried beneath the weight of her own fears. It was the faintest glimmer of trust. Maybe, just maybe, she could begin to let go of the past and let herself be something else, something more than the girl who had been branded a thief. Maybe, for the first time in a long while, she could be herself. As the weeks passed, the crisp winds of autumn began to give way to the biting cold of winter. The ranch, once bathed in golden light, now stood beneath a blanket of snow. Emma had learned to embrace the rhythm of life on the ranch. The harsh physical labor had made her stronger, and the quiet moments had given her time to reflect. But more than that, something had begun to shift within her. She was no longer just running from her past. She was beginning to build a future, one small, steady step at a time. Yet, despite the comfort of the routine, the past never completely let go. It lingered, a constant weight on her shoulders. The doubts, the accusations from Clearwater, they were always there, waiting in the back of her mind. Emma had never expected the world to offer her forgiveness. She didn't even expect to clear her name. The truth was that she wasn't sure she even cared about proving her innocence anymore. But as time went on, something deep inside her began to stir, a need for justice, even if it could never come in the way she had once imagined. Emma had learned to accept that the world wasn't always fair. She had learned that sometimes, innocence was not enough to free you from the weight of other people's judgments. But Jack's words, his constant quiet support, had begun to plant seeds of something else in her heart. He had taught her that she didn't have to carry the burden of the past forever. That maybe, just maybe, she could move forward without the need to explain herself to everyone. Still, the ghost of Clearwater haunted her. She had heard bits and pieces of gossip when she passed through town on rare errands. People still talked about her, still believed she had stolen the money. The real thief, of course, had never been found, but in the eyes of the people who had once known her, it didn't matter. Once a thief, always a thief. Emma had learned the hard way that once a reputation was tainted, it was nearly impossible to wash it clean. One afternoon, while Emma was working with the horses, she noticed a familiar figure on the horizon. It was a man, riding a horse, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. At first, she thought it was just a traveler passing through, but as the rider came closer, something about him felt different. There was a weight to his presence, a purposeful determination in his stride. And as he drew nearer, Emma realized with a shock that it was one of the men from Clearwater, the sheriff. Her heart skipped a beat. Why was he here? What did he want? She had done everything she could to move on, to leave her past behind. She had started a new life, far from the town that had turned its back on her. But now, it seemed, the past had come to find her. The sheriff dismounted and walked toward her, his boots crunching against the snow. His face was hard, set in a grim expression, and his eyes seemed to search her as if trying to peel away the layers of time that had built up between them. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't know what to say. Her instinct was to run, to hide from him, to avoid whatever was coming. But she knew that wouldn't work. She had already run once before, and it hadn't helped. "Emma Walker," the sheriff's voice was low but firm, "we need to talk." "They're still looking into it," she thought. "Why now? Why after all this time?" "I've already told you everything I know," Emma said, her voice shaky but steady. "I didn't take the money. I had nothing to do with it." Emma could feel the tension between them, the weight of his expectations. It was like the entire conversation had been rehearsed in his mind, like he had already decided what he was going to hear from her. "I know you said that, but there's been new information," the sheriff said slowly, his gaze never wavering. "We've found the real culprit." Finally, someone else has been caught, she thought. But why come to me about it now? The sheriff continued, his voice dropping lower as if to share something confidential. "The man who took the money, he's gone, left town, disappeared. But the truth is, he was always right under our noses." The idea that someone else could have stolen the money was both a relief and a shock. But there was something unsettling about the sheriff's tone, as if the matter wasn't as simple as it sounded. "Why are you telling me this?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The sheriff sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging. "Because the damage is done, Emma. Even though we know who did it, the town will never forget what happened. The people, they've already made their minds up. You were accused, and that's a story that sticks with people, no matter the truth." It would always follow her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. "I don't need their forgiveness," Emma said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I just need the truth." She had wanted the truth. She had wanted justice. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to do with it. The truth hadn't erased the pain, hadn't erased the way the town had treated her. It hadn't undone the damage. She had spent so much time running, trying to outrun the accusations, but it had all caught up with her in a way she hadn't expected. But even as the sheriff's figure disappeared into the distance, a part of Emma began to understand something she hadn't before. The truth, no matter how important, didn't always change the way the world saw you. It didn't always fix everything, but it could still set you free, even if the world didn't believe it. The truth was out there now. The real thief had been found. And while Clearwater would never truly know the full story, Emma had something more important: the knowledge that she hadn't been the one to steal. She hadn't been the one to break the trust of the people she had once cared about. And that, for the first time in a long while, was enough. The months that followed the sheriff's visit were different from the ones that had come before. The air had grown colder, the days shorter, and winter settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. The snow had piled high against the barns and fences, making the world seem smaller, quieter. For the first time since Emma had left Clearwater, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. The truth about the stolen money had finally been revealed. The real thief had disappeared, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, but Emma had learned to let go of the need for vindication. She had spent so long wishing for the world to see her innocence, for people to know the truth. But she had realized that some things were beyond her control. She couldn't change the way the world saw her, but she could change the way she saw herself. Jack had been right all along. The past couldn't define her forever. It was a part of her story, but it didn't have to be the whole story. And in that realization, Emma had begun to rebuild not just her life, but her sense of self. She had stopped running from her past. Now she was standing still, letting herself grow into the woman she was meant to be. It wasn't easy. Some days the memories of Clearwater still haunted her, like shadows that refused to fade. There were moments when the guilt and frustration threatened to rise up, but she had learned to breathe through them, to face them rather than run. Jack's steady presence had become more than just a comfort. It had become a lifeline. His quiet belief in her, his patience, and his kindness had begun to heal the parts of her that she had thought were beyond repair. And over time, that healing had extended to more than just Emma. The ranch had become more than just a place where she worked. It had become a home, a place where she wasn't judged for her past, a place where she could simply be. One afternoon, as Emma was finishing her work in the barn, Jack came to find her. He was holding something in his hands, wrapped in a piece of cloth. His face was serious, but there was something softer in his eyes. He had a way of looking at her as though he could see things she couldn't, as though he understood parts of her that she hadn't yet understood herself. "I've been meaning to give you something," he said, his voice steady but kind. Emma raised an eyebrow, glancing at the bundle he was holding. "What is it?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Jack handed it to her, and when she unwrapped it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a small, weathered leather journal, the kind that looked like it had been passed down through generations. It was the sort of thing you didn't find in stores anymore, a relic of another time. She ran her fingers over the worn edges, the soft leather smooth beneath her touch. "What's this for?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack shrugged slightly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's for you," he said simply. "A place to write your thoughts, your story. You've got a lot inside of you, Emma, and I think it's time you let some of it out." Maybe it was time to speak her truth, not to anyone else but to herself. "I don't know where to start," Emma said, laughing softly, as though the words themselves were foreign to her. "You start wherever feels right," Jack replied, his voice gentle. "This is for you. You can write anything you want." She had spent so long running, so long fighting against the past, that she had forgotten how to simply be. She had forgotten what it felt like to belong to something bigger than herself. Over the next few weeks, Emma found herself writing more and more in the journal. Some days, the words came easily, flowing from her like a river that had been dammed for too long. Other days, the pen hesitated over the page, unsure of what to say. But through it all, she felt a sense of peace, like she was finally giving herself the space to heal, to move forward. In the quiet of her cabin at night, she would sit by the fire, the soft flickering light casting shadows on the walls, and write. Sometimes she wrote about the ranch, the beauty of the land, the way the horses' hooves would leave prints in the snow, the way the wind would whisper through the trees. Sometimes she wrote about the people she had met along the way, about Jack, and about the way her life had been rebuilt, piece by piece. And sometimes, when the memories of Clearwater became too heavy, she wrote about that too. About the accusation, the pain, the loneliness, but each time she felt the weight of it lifting just a little more, as though with every word she was shedding a layer of the past. The ranch, with its vast open skies and endless stretches of land, had become a place of renewal for Emma. But more than that, it had become a place of belonging. She wasn't just a worker on the land anymore. She was a part of something bigger, a family. And that family wasn't defined by blood. It wasn't defined by the people she had been born to or the people she had left behind. It was defined by the people who had chosen to welcome her into their lives, who had seen her for who she was, not for who others thought her to be. One cold evening, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Jack sat down beside Emma in front of the fire. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the snow against the windows. For a long time, neither of them spoke. But then Jack cleared his throat and looked at her, his eyes filled with something warm and steady. "You know," he said slowly, "I never really had a family, not like the one people talk about. My mother died when I was young, and my father, well, he wasn't much of a father. But over the years, I've come to realize that family doesn't always come in the way we expect it. It's about the people who show up. The ones who stick around, even when things get tough." "I think you're right," Emma said softly, her voice steady now. "Family isn't about who you're born to, it's about the people who choose to stay." For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. The winter passed and the snow began to melt, revealing the earth beneath it. Spring came slowly, like a breath of fresh air after a long, cold night. The flowers bloomed, the trees regained their leaves, and Emma's life continued to unfold, page by page, like the journal in her hands. In the quiet of the ranch, surrounded by people who cared for her, Emma had found something more than just a new life. She had found a family built not from blood, but from love, loyalty, and the simple act of choosing one another every day. And as she looked out over the land, the sun rising over the horizon, Emma realized that the story wasn't over yet. There was still more to write, more to experience. But for the first time in her life, she was ready to face whatever came next. With her family beside her, she knew she could handle anything.